Defense won the day for Seattle in Super Bowl 60, but there's a few other things the Falcons could take note of as they try to build their Super Bowl winning blueprint.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And of course, if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's episode, we're doing a quicker episode. We're going to start throwing some more of these in to the lineup, into the rotation each week, potentially, depending on if stuff is going on, potentially every day here on the podcast throughout the offseason. So we're going to get this thing rolling as we now officially turn the page on the 2025 season. I'll give you my thoughts watching Super Bowl 60, my takeaways from the game, talk about that Seahawks defense, and talking about, are we back to defense winning championships now, or is still offense a big part of the picture? We'll talk about, Sam Darnold, and the resurrection of the quote-unquote lesser quarterback winning a Super Bowl. And maybe that gives the Falcons a little bit more hope, potentially with a young quarterback like Michael Penix. And we'll also look at sort of some of the lessons that we can borrow from the Seahawks and say, okay, well, if Seattle can win a Super Bowl doing this, maybe the Falcons can win a Super Bowl doing this. So we'll get into all of that on today's episode. But we'll start off giving my thoughts on the Super Bowl and my big takeaways from the game. And it was a pretty, compelling defensive battle, particularly early on. Things kind of busted wide open with a lot of points scored in the fourth quarter. But predominantly, this was a defensive slugfest, a punt fest, right? Big fans of Michael Dixon and Bryce Behringer. Those of us that were down at the Senior Bowl back in 2023, that was my first Senior Bowl. We watched Bryce Behringer. That man was booming some punts, and it's like, oh, this guy's going places. And he went places in this Super Bowl game. New England really didn't generate any offense, so it was pretty much the Bryce Behringer hour for the first 2.5 hours of this game. But, I think this game is probably going to draw some comparisons to Super Bowl 53. That was that Patriots-Rams Super Bowl. That was a snooze fest that ended in a 13-3 win for the Patriots. And, I remember a lot of people were like, oh, if you don't appreciate this defensive battle, then you don't really love football. And it's like, no, that was boring. This game was boring, but not as boring as that. Or maybe I just, maybe my palate has been, a little bit more sophisticated than it was, 7 years ago, watching that snooze fest. And, I could appreciate a snooze fest more readily today. But, I think Seattle was able to really dominate this game, being able to control the line of scrimmage. I believe they finished with 6 sacks in this game, winning in the trenches. We'll talk more about how, Ian Cunningham's beautiful plan when it comes to that, and something that the Falcons can borrow from. But for the most part, this game went how we thought it was. I think, a lot of us thought Seattle should win this game. They were by far the better team, the more well-rounded team. And no offense to the Patriots, they played a super soft schedule. They won the games that they needed to win to get to this point. But when you looked at them on paper and on the field, you're like, yeah, they don't really match up that well with this Seahawks team. And that proved to be the case in this game. To me, the one worry I had with Seattle going into this game, because these things can be unpredictable with the Super Bowl, where the team that you think is going to win doesn't, as we know, any given Sunday, including in February, was my main worry was maybe Sam Darnold's going to turn back into a pumpkin. And he did not do that. He was fine in this game. Obviously, Kenneth Walker was the star of the Seahawks offense for most of this game, and Seattle was able to lean on their run game as well as their defense in this game. And so you didn't need Sam Darnold to have to, throw the ball 40, 50 times and win them the game. New England kind of needed Drake May to do that, and there was really not a whole lot that you had seen from Drake May in January that made you feel confident that he was going to be able to do that against this caliber of defense. And so this game was heavily, favored in the case of Seattle, controlling this game pretty much from start to finish. And I think because of Seattle's defense being so good, I think it's going to start a conversation or restart a conversation and cause people to re-examine the old adage of, does defense win championships? And as you've heard us talk about on this podcast for the last 5 years, team success is primarily driven by offense, but now people will be like, well, the defense is back, right? And it's like, sure, defense matters, right? Our stance has never been that, defense is irrelevant, but I still think offense still drives team success. But defense, I think, as you get further along in the season, and particularly in the postseason, becomes more meaningful. And that's why it always seems like, in these Super Bowls, in these NFC, AFC championship games, like the better defense is the team that winds up, winning it all, is because the further you go along in the season, the better every team is. And so it's, the thing that's going to kind of break the tie is the team that has the better, you're usually going to have two teams with good offenses. And the thing that's going to give one team the advantage is the team that has the better defense. And so I think that proved to be the case. It's not as if Seattle's offense was slouches this year. They were 10th, I believe, in DVOA this year, 3rd in points, 8th in yards, 18th in EPA, but 4th in EPA during the postseason. And so they were able to turn off EPA per play, I should stress. They were able to turn up their offense in the postseason, completely killing the narrative that we talked about a little bit with Clint Kubiak on whether or not his offense tail off at the end of the season, and is his offense capable of playing at a high level in the playoffs? Well, it was very much capable of playing at a high level for most of the playoffs. And so it's always that notion that you hear me talk about on this podcast is it's always better. Like, I have yet to find an exception. It is always better to be good at two things than it is to be good at one thing. And so when it comes to offense versus defense, right, one may be a little bit more valuable than the other, but if you're good at both of those things, that's always going to be more valuable than any team that's, good at just one of those things. Same thing with run versus the pass. It's why we talk about diversifying your run game. It's why we talk about, diversifying your pass rush play. It's why we talk about building a diverse group of wide receivers in your secondary, where you have multiple skill sets that complement each other, as opposed to just basically doubling down on one type of skill set. And yes, I'm talking to you, Terry Fontenot, a lover of shrimp cornerbacks. But, I think Seattle's defense absolutely deserves its flowers. Mike McDonald, I remember talking about him in that 2024 cycle, and we talked about him. Is this guy going to be the next Bill Belichick? And at that time, it was just more speculation based off of the hype he was getting coming off that 23 Ravens season. But he's kind of lived up to the hype these last 2 years in Seattle, and manifesting it in this Super Bowl win is right out of the career path of not Hall of Fame caliber head coach Bill Belichick. Yes, I'm going to relish that all offseason long. Anytime I'm feeling down, I just think about Bill Belichick got denied from the Hall of Fame. My mood will instantly lift. Just makes me feel warm and cozy, like a warm blanket on a cold winter night. Bill Belichick is not in Canton. Feels so good. But that being said, like, I do think Mike McDonald has lived up to the hype so far based off of that. And one of the things I always hate every year after the Super Bowl is the overuse of, like, the post Super Bowl narrative, and the team that wins the Super Bowl is like, well, every team's got to do it their way. And that's why, like, we're talking about defense and all that stuff. And I hate that. And people overrate that stuff because every year it's a different formula. It's a different blueprint that's going to win. And people act like, well, the formula that most recently won is the formula that every team is going to copy from here on in eternity. And it's like, no, it worked for this team. It'll be a different formula, work for another team. But all that to say, let's talk about the Falcons borrowing the Seahawks formula, because I do think there is going to be a lot of overlap when you look at potentially the ultimate version of the Atlanta Falcons, a team that could be in Super Bowl contention in the future. It may look a lot like this Seattle Seahawks team, and we'll break down some of the things that they can borrow from the Seahawks team as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the winter games are officially here, and if you're anything like me, you're locking in for events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years, and it's why following the winter games on FanDuel just makes the most sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on sports that you care about the most, FanDuel is going to give you more ways to stay connection to the action. It's the Olympics, so the drama, the intensity is going to be there. Whether you're an expert on curling or speed skating, hockey, or you're like me and you're just like, you don't know the first thing about half of these sports, but even niche events become must watch when you're fully locked into the competition in the Olympics. So whether it's rooting for your home country or you just love an underdog story, FanDuel is going to keep the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. The Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Now, hiring is not easy. Just ask the Atlanta Falcons. It's often you find a candidate that looks good on paper, and then you find out they're not the right fit. But with Indeed sponsored job, today's sponsor, you can find the right match. If you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling, get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed sponsored job is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a higher than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results by using Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. That's Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Head there right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. So when we talk about the Falcons, and one of the things that has been a big talking point over the last couple of weeks, especially, is the quick turnarounds for teams like New England, right? Who had 2 4-win seasons and were in the Super Bowl, and obviously were a handful of possessions away from potentially winning the Super Bowl. And then you look at Seattle, where Seattle wasn't down in the dumps by any means under Pete Carroll. They were still a competitive team, but they were probably closer to this current version of the Atlanta Falcons. And win 10 games with Mike McDonald in year 1, miss the playoffs, and win 14 games, whatever it is this year, and win the Super Bowl. And when you look at why those teams were able to turn those things around, it's not to say this one factor is the only reason, but the biggest factor, the biggest accelerant in terms of their success and their turnarounds, for New England, it's been the quarterback position. For Seattle, it's been their defense, right? And when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, if they're going to also have that big acceleration under Kevin Stefanski, the Seahawks are probably that blueprint that they can probably most mirror at this point in time, given all the questions we have at the quarterback position, right? That when we talk about, the Seahawks formula for most of this Super Bowl 60 game, it was the run game and the defense, right? We know Seattle's run game wasn't great for most of the season. They were much better in the second half of the season. And obviously we're pretty good in this Super Bowl game. Kenneth Walker looking outstanding. One of my favorite running backs. When I'm tired of watching, Derrick Henry bulldoze guys and Bijan walk on water, one of my favorite running backs to watch is Kenneth Walker. But the run game plus the defense, this is kind of the winning formula for the Falcons that the Kevin Stefanski era can potentially bring, right? We know when we look at Kevin Stefanski's success in Cleveland, the one thing that was consistently good when Cleveland was consistently good under Kevin Stefanski for those first 4 years was a run game, right? It wasn't because they had these super high-powered passing attacks. It was because they could run the football with Nick Chubb and one of the best offensive lines of football. And then when you look at, having one of the top defenses that you see with Seattle under Mike McDonald, Jeff Ulbrich had one of the top defenses in New York for several years when he was coordinator there under Robert Saleh. So we know he can coordinate a number 1 caliber defense, as he did in New York. And we saw the big boost that this defense made this past season. And, that to me is the formula that you can look at. That's the foundation for what you want to see this Falcon team, that if this team is going to be competing at the highest level, we're going to be talking about, a dominant run game. We're going to be talking about a dominant defense. And then it's really about whether or not the Falcons can elevate the other areas. But if they're going to be able to dominate in those 2 areas as their foundation, they're going to have to build in the trenches, right? In the ways that Ian Cunningham wants to do as the new general manager of the team, believing in building in the trenches. And that sort of complacent attitude when it comes to the Falcons trenches has to go. They have to be dominant in the trenches. If this is going to be your formula, run game plus defense, you got to be dominant in the trenches in order to get that to the highest level, because, there's going to be, teams that can throw the football at a high level that you're going to have to go through in January, more than likely, if you want to get to playing football in February. And you need to be able to dominate those teams in the trenches. And, we talk about it with the offensive line, diversifying the run game. One of those things that we're hoping to see Bill Callahan do here in Atlanta. Again, going back to that point of being good at 2 different run schemes than it is, being good at one, like the Falcons have been in the wide zone, We've talked about it before with this Falcons offensive line. It's often labeled, oh, this is one of the better offensive lines of football. It's a top 10 offensive line. And we've said, yeah, sure, it is. Until it's 3rd and 1, until it's 2nd and 2, and then it's the worst offensive line of football, going back to a conversation we had 2 weeks ago, or maybe now 3 weeks ago, when it came to how this team has been the worst short yardage team in the NFL for 5 years running. And then when you compare that to teams like Seattle and New England, who aren't necessarily known for having dominant offensive lines, but guess what they are in short yardage? 15th and 19th. And so you can sit there and say, oh, we have a better offensive line than them. Not when it comes to 3rd and 1. They're much better than that. And again, you don't have to be elite in that area. You just got to be decent, as Seattle and New England were, that when you need a yard, you can get a yard. And then when you look at the defensive side of the ball, when it comes to the trenches, having that run defense, having that pass rush, we saw big strides in both of those areas. The run defense really took off in the second half of the season after being terrible in the first half of the season. And we, of course, know that the pass rush was one of the top pass rushes in the NFL this year. And so they need to continue building off of that. What we saw from the run defense in the second half, what we saw from the pass rush this year, and continue building off of that. And then you can reach that dominant level that you can build and win in the trenches. And the last point we'll talk about is the quarterback conversation, right? And Sam Darnold winning the Super Bowl is going to do wonders for reclamation projects and not necessarily needing an elite quarterback to win a Super Bowl. That's been kind of the dominant narrative. Oh, you got to have Tom Brady. You got to have Patrick Mahomes. You got to have Matt Stafford. You got no chance to win a Super Bowl without those things, right? And Sam Darnold completely throws that out the window. And every now and then, like the last time we had a quarterback like that, it was probably Nick Foles winning a Super Bowl. With that, for that 2017 Eagles team. And, back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was much more common in general because the quarterback play was not to the same level as it has been for this sort of golden age of quarterbacks. But the question is the golden age over with Tom Brady and Peyton Manning and Matt Ryan and Phillip Rivers and Drew Brees and all these guys, retiring over the last, 10, 12 years? Are we entering a lesser age of quarterback? And is it more possible for the Sam Darnolds of the world to potentially take their team to a Super Bowl, given the right circumstances? And time will tell on that issue. I think this is going to be the thing that's going to help Michael Penix the most in terms of the overall skill set of Sam Darnold, who played really well this year. But, when we do the quarterback rankings, Sam Darnold's not going to be a top 10 quarterback. Maybe you can make a case he's the 12th best quarterback in the league. Maybe you only make the case he's the 18th best quarterback in the league. That seems to be, to me, as we look at what we know about Michael Penix today, seems to be a much more realistic, range of outcomes for Michael Penix. That 12 to 18 range as far as a quarterback goes. And so we'll see if, Michael Penix can reach that level, and we can see if you put the right team around that type of quarterback, as we saw with Sam Darnold this year. It's doable to win a championship, as we saw, 8 years ago with Nick Foles. It's doable. But we'll see if the Falcons can achieve that. And, the other thing about the reclamation of Sam Darnold, we talked about this. What was this? Back in 2021, the summer of 2021, we talked about Josh Rosen, and people were hyping up Josh Rosen as the next reclamation project. He was going to be the heir apparent to Matt Ryan. You remember that, guys? And we were like, ooh, on this podcast. And we were like, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't bet on Josh Rosen. But we did a whole episode, like kind of breaking down the keys to reclamation projects. And we looked at guys like Kurt Warner and Ryan Tannehill and a couple of other, I think Ryan Fitzpatrick and a couple of others. And now you can throw Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold into the mix. And they've sort of, continued the narrative that we discussed in that episode back in the summer of 2021, which is the successful reclamation projects almost universally have anywhere between 50 and 100 starts in the league before they successfully are reclaimed. And Sam Darnold completes that. He had 56 starts going into his last season with the Vikings, right? And started 56 games, went to the Vikings, added 17 more before joining the Seahawks, right? And so that narrative continues. And so we look at Michael Penix when we talk about, the amount of starts that a quarterback like Michael Penix is going to have to make before. And basically the argument I made then, I should explain it for those of you that weren't everydayers, is basically at a certain point, quarterbacks need reps, right? And at a certain point, you get enough reps where you kind of have figured out the league. But it usually takes about 50 plus starts for you to get enough reps for you to kind of figure it out. And then you can go to the right environment, as the Tannehills did in Tennessee and Darnold has in Minnesota and Seattle and Baker and Tampa Bay, et cetera, where if you get into the right situation, you can be a successful quarterback now because you figured it out. And so Penix, we're at 12 starts. We need about 38 starts before he gets there. So we're talking about a timeline of 28, 29, where at that point, if Michael Penix makes those enough starts, then you can be confident he's either figured it out, right? And we'll talk about some of these quarterbacks this year that the Falcons could get as a bridge quarterback for that, one of whom I believe Justin Fields is now crossed the 50 start threshold. So we'll have a conversation on whether or not he's going to check that reclamation box. Check that reclamation box. Yeah, that's the right. It's like, what's the sentence I'm trying to say? I can't speak. If only good thing I don't have to do this for a living. But those will be conversations of the future. So those are my thoughts on the Falcons potentially borrowing the Seahawks blueprint. I do think it's realistic, not in the sense of like, well, you got to copy what the most recent Super Bowl team did, and that's going to be your winning formula. But in terms of just the natural progression of this Falcon team, yeah, I think that's what you're kind of looking at. So that's going to do it for us. A shorter version of the podcast, still over 20 minutes. I was shooting for like 15. You know me, I can't edit myself. So more of these on the horizon for you guys. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On Patriots, Locked On Seahawks to get the latest on those teams projected on Super Bowl 60, as well as others. And of course, join the Everydayer Club at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com and get some of the perks for just $5 a month or $50 a year. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.